I guarantee you're going to have proration questions on your real estate licensing exam. In today's video, we're going to do one of those proration problems. I'm going to show you how to prorate rent. All that in this video. In today's video, I'm going to show you how to prorate rents. Now, there's three areas in which you may have a proration question. They may make you prorate real estate taxes, they may make you prorate interest on a loan, or rents. And in today's video, I'm going to show you how to prorate rents. Now, there are some things you need to know before we actually jump into making the calculations here. Very important. Number one is we have to understand that it's a 360-day or a 365-day rule for the calculations. And here's what I mean. If it's a 360-day year, then every month is considered to have 30 days, regardless of how many days are actually in that month. For example, if it's February, you're going to calculate based on 30 days, not the actual days that February has, which is 28 or 29 days. If it's March, you're going to calculate the problem based on 30 days, even though there's 31 days in the month of March. Now, here's the thing to remember, though. If it's the 360-day rule that they want you to use for the calculation, they will specifically and directly tell you that in your licensing exam. Now, for the most part, I've only seen these type of questions in real estate brokers' exams, not the salesperson's. So you need to at least assume there's a chance that you're going to have this on your licensing exam. Now, if it's the 365-day, that just simply means that no matter whatever the amount of days there are in that particular month, that's what you use for your calculation. So if it's January, you're going to use 31 days. If it's April, you're going to do 30. The other thing to keep in mind is rents are always paid in advance. Unlike mortgage payments that are paid in arrears, we always assume that rents are paid in advance. And I'll illustrate that more in just a minute here. And the last thing you have to understand, anytime they're asking for prorations, here's really what they're asking for. They want to know if it's a cost or a credit to the seller, or if it's a cost or a credit to the buyer, and how much is that cost or credit. And that's why we calculate these problems. And one last thing before we get to our problem here, understand cost and debit mean the same thing. And the licensing exam can pose the question using any one of these two terms interchangeably. So you have to know that cost and debit, they mean the same thing. All right, so let's actually get to our sample problem for this video. Monthly rent on 123 Main Street is $1,500. Amy, the tenant of 123 Main Street, made her April 1st payment in full to the landlord. The landlord is selling the property and has a scheduled closing date of the 21st of April. Calculate the buyer and the seller's debts and credits. All right, what I like to do when I'm doing proration problems is illustrate it. I like visual content. And so I'm going to put the time continuum for those prorations. So let's take a look at our problem here. First of all, we know that they're talking about the month of April, and we know that there are 30 days in the month of April. We also know, because the problem told us, that the landlord is selling the property, and closing is scheduled for April 21st. We also know that the tenant did pay the rent in full in the amount of $1,500 back here on the first of the month. What does that mean? That means, and we have to make this inference, that the seller is already holding the $1,500, but the seller also is only going to own the property for 21 days. At that point, it's going to become the new buyer's property. So from the closing date through April 30th, part of this $1,500 rent is the buyer's. So this is where we're making the proration. How much does the buyer get in this case, and how much does the seller have to give? So we know that for the first part of the month, the landlord, they already got the money, so we know that this is a seller cost. And why is it a cost? Because they already have the $1,500 and they're going to have to give a certain amount of money to the buyer at closing, so the buyer has the money that they're entitled to for the time that they owned it, that part of the month. So therefore, we know that this is a buyer credit. Now we need to figure out how much of a credit and also the number of days so we can do our calculation. All right, so let's do our calculations now. We know that the total monthly rent was $1,500 or $1,500. Now we're going to divide that by the total number of days in the month. In this case, it's 30. And that would give us a total of $1,500 divided by 30 is $50 per day. Now that $50 is what we call per diem. Now one thing to keep in mind every once in a while when we're doing calculations, the real estate licensing exam, depending on which provider is giving the exam, does use that term per diem. So you just got to know that per diem simply means per day. All right, so we have $50 per day. Now we have to figure out how many days the buyer actually owned the property for the month of April. We know that closing is on the 21st. All right, so how do we handle the day of closing? Who is responsible for the cost and the credits for the day of closing? Well, two things. Either the test question is going to tell you that, and I have seen test questions actually say the buyer's responsible for closing, the day of closing, or the seller is. So if that's the way that the test question is set up, then obviously you have enough information to do your calculations. But if the test question makes no reference to who is responsible for the day of closing, you must always assume that it's the buyer's responsibility, all right? Buyer's responsibility for closing for debts and credits unless the test question specifically tells you otherwise. Keep that in mind, that's very important. All right, so the test question didn't make a reference one way or another, so we're going to assume the buyer is responsible for the day of closing. Therefore, we know the buyer is getting a credit, so the buyer gets the credit for the day of closing. So that means they're going to get that $50 for the 21st, which is the day of closing. So we do the 21st, 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, 27th, 28th, 29th, 30. That's 10 days. And notice I used my fingers. What I have found over the years teaching this class with students, when we're doing proration problems, use your fingers. Go back to that kindergarten math. It will save your bacon during the test. All right, so we know that it's the per diem day, or the daily rate is $50. We're going to multiply that by 10, which is the number of days remaining in April. So we know that that comes to $500, and that is a buyer credit of $500. So let's go over here. Remember, because I said every proration problem, they want to know a buyer cost or credit and a seller cost or credit. So in this case, we know that it was a buyer credit of $500. Therefore, if it's a buyer credit for $500, then it must also be a seller cost or a seller debit. All right, a cost of $500. Now here's something very important to remember when you're doing prorations. When you're talking about taxes or rent, whatever that figure is, it's the same for the other party, just in a different category. So we know that it's a cost to the seller for $500. Therefore, it is a credit to the buyer for $500. Here's one other tip to remember. Let's say one of the options to this test question was C. And C said that it was a seller cost of $800 and a buyer credit of $500. Notice that the two figures here are different. That should automatically tell you that C is not an option for the correct answer. They have to at least be the same numeric value. So that's just another one of those little testing tips for you. That's prorations of rent in a nutshell. Hey, here's another video that may help you with your studies for your real estate exam. And before you leave, don't forget, hit that circle next door to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so. All right, that's all I have for this video. We'll see you in the next video.